is understanding the importance of lived experience, because the mentee learner in a mentoring way taps into that lived experience of the mentor. And I think it would be great to just take a trip around Doug's yesterday.
Well, and it was most definitely a very interesting day, because it caused me to do lots of reflection. And so and the reflection was more so on, just because you and I have a really strong wealth of knowledge when it comes to mentoring, not everybody shares that same position. And I had a couple calls yesterday where it was I was actually taken aback to some extent, when certainly my morning started off where I have no knowledge whatsoever about mentoring, so please tell me more. And that's how the conversation evolved. And at the end of the conversation, when we finally decided to sort of, okay, we're going to stay in touch and all that great stuff, it was the idea. I took a step back and I went, okay, I think we've done what we were supposed to do by providing the education. But the one message that stuck out for me, and it's one that I've heard numerous times, is I did not realize there was that much to mentoring. And I had that actually in both calls, the morning call and then one mid-afternoon yesterday, where it was, once we had the conversation and I explained the concepts and the processes, certainly at an entry level, and even sharing what it looks like with the idea of the journey mentor, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but with the idea of the journey mentor and getting into some different areas of being able to use mentoring as a means to provide support, the support structure. So one of the things that came out was one of the points that you mentioned, which is the whole idea of the lived experience. And I guess my favorite topic that always seems to come up when we start talking about that is, well, you have to have industry specific experience in order to mentor in that. And what I shared with both people was, that's a nice to have, not a need to have. And I told the story about how going into a manufacturing industry where I had no previous experience whatsoever, but I knew how to ask questions, and that's what I did. And I not only did I gain the knowledge that I needed to continue to work in that space, but I also built strong relationships, trusted relationships that I would not have had if I gone in with some preconceived notions that this is what the industry is about.
So I think the point that you're raising is there's a lot of awareness still has to happen in terms of what is mentoring in comparison to coaching, facilitating, counseling, advising, all those different elements. And we'll certainly get into that more and more with the international mentoring community. But the notion is that you said that you asked some questions to be able to get into that domain of activity. I'm using the word domains, like domain of knowledge, domain of skills, to be able to get to a point that you could have the conversation. But I believe, and I'm going to use but there, but I believe that by asking those questions, did you not set up for the mentee that you were going to interact with this view of the value of asking questions?
Short answer would be yes. Sometimes, depending on the individuals, sometimes they start to understand or realize that, every time I give an answer, he asks me more questions. And so I think for some of the mentees that I'm working with in those situations, the asking of the questions catches a lot of them off guard more than anything else, because they're just why is he asking me, you know, to tell a little bit more? Why does he need to know about what I do in particular? So, you know, because one of my questions will be, so tell me a little bit about what you do on a daily basis. And then how do you interact with other departments, other parts of the organization? So explain some of that to me. What products and services do you offer? Who's your target audience? And going through all of that and gleaning all of that. And so a couple things is that, number one, it demonstrates an interest, a keen interest in them as a person and what they do. But it also, as you explore deeper and deeper and deeper, it also helps you gain that deeper understanding of them as an individual, which is probably why you're there in the first place.
And then that leads them into this notion, well, if I have this lived experience sitting across from me,
Yeah.
right, or computer to computer, I have to tap into that somehow. So asking questions of that person. So essentially it starts to flip around a little bit, whereas the mentor is asking the questions to establish the arrangement, sorry. Then the mentee is, okay, but I need to foster the relationship so I can get to a point of asking them questions to tap into their experience. And then it's sort of between us, we're now doing what it is we do, this sort of magical dance of mentoring. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that would definitely be fair. One of the thoughts that poured through my mind was one of the individuals that I had spent some time with, a bit of an abrasive demeanor, and wouldn't some of the times wouldn't take the time to sort of pause and reflect before they actually spoke, and it ended up they'd get themselves into some grief, and then it would be time for a mentoring session with me, and I would ask one simple question: is there a different way we could have dealt with this particular situation? And you know, they kind of go, well, what do you think? And I said, no, you know, I need you to sort of think your way through this, and maybe let me help you out. What would happen if in that situation you were to do this, this, or this? What would be some of the outcomes that you would get as a result of taking either one of those three options and getting them to think? And when we did that, it was surprising what the outcomes would actually be, and how that individual got to understand and know that if we sat down to have a conversation and he told me what happened, he could pretty much put money in the bank on the fact that I'm going to fire a bunch of questions at him and literally force him to rethink his way through that situation.
And that's the sense of the reflection in, reflection on. Often, like coaches, we're talking something that's very similar to coaching as well, is that from a coaching perspective, you're asking questions of the coachee, but you're doing it from a position of what is it that you've got to get done? What are the accountabilities you've got to fulfill? Not necessarily what is about life and how what you're doing interacts with your life and the life of others, right? Mentoring has a little bit of a different flavor in the use of its questions to be able to get a person to reflect on and reflect in. And this reflection aspect is another important part of the international mentoring community, to get people to understand that. And then to get to a point where they have the practice of, well, while I'm in the conversation, I can be reflecting. And when the conversation is sort of done, I can reflect on the conversation, because you're going, oh, okay, there's more to this than just fulfilling my accountability, getting my job done, and doing it so I can sort of say, yes, check, I did my performance for the day. Mentoring has more than just simply checklists. Mm-hmm. And it's more about that guiding the person to the pathway I jokingly say, but it's not necessarily a joke either, is to have this notion of being able to see it in a different way, and that's what's really important. And yeah, so that reflection piece is so important, isn't it, Doug? Because that's really one of the main shifts that takes place between coaching and mentoring.
Well, and you said the word checklist, and you talked about, you know, checking off the boxes, so to speak, on a checklist and that. And what I find is that certainly with my mentoring practice is that I don't have a checklist per se. I have an idea depending upon the initial part of the conversation. I have an idea of where we're going to go, but I don't want to put myself in a place where I have to follow a checklist. And, you know, if somebody says this, you go this way. And if somebody said, I don't want to go that. And I've seen it where I've had people that are wanting to get started in the mentoring space where they've said, well, have you got a list of questions that you can give me that I can ask, or a checklist that I can follow, so that if I get into, you know, if I'm sitting down with somebody and we're kind of staring at each other and neither one of us wants to begin the conversation, and yeah, that does happen, is the idea of being able to sort of think on your feet and being able to work your way through that without having a checklist to follow.
Yes. And I brought that up purposely is because in my time, what I do is more of what's called facilitative mentoring, is that I'm drawing ideas out of the person. So facilitating them and then mentoring them and learning from that interactions with that person as well. In our definition, the international mentoring community, it's a two-way trusted conversation, a collaborative conversation that's establishing a collaborative alliance. And if we go into it with that checklist, it sort of starts to feel a little mechanical.
Yeah.
And I can appreciate where someone might be new to mentoring and they're going, I wouldn't mind having a few little things to work with, but I wouldn't necessarily call them checklists. What I would do is I would just call them, you know, keywords, keyword phrases, or anything like that. So, yeah.
If I can add to that.
Sure, go for it.
Doug and Stephen, one of the best practices that I had brought forward when I was chairing the BPW Calgary mentorship group was to actually bring a list of suggested questions, just sort of rapport building questions to get them started, so that, you know, if someone was brand new to mentoring, someone was brand new to being a protege, that they weren't, as you say, just sitting staring at each other saying, okay, what do we talk about? And you know, some of them are fairly basic questions, but it's still, I think it still gave them a level of comfort that they were doing it right from the beginning.
Yes.
Yeah.
But would it be, Yvonne, that the list wasn't necessarily like a chronological progressive? There's still a randomness to it so that you could play with it, versus someone taking a series of questions like a checklist and going, well, 1 has to go to 2, 2 has to go to 3, 3 has to go to 4. I think you left it more on the random side.
It was, yes, it was guidelines. So, you know, here are some suggested questions. And then I also had taken it further and put a framework together covering off the first 6 months of the relationship, because at that first year when I took on the program, it was a year-long program. And I wanted to allow for the participants to help build out the remaining conversations, but I was encouraging them to consider, you know, if the person's working in this particular field, you know, maybe there are some associations that they might consider joining, or some specific magazines that are very relevant and have a lot of content that might be helpful for them, or maybe inviting them to a networking meeting that they never would have the opportunity to be invited to before because it was guests only. So it was a list of a number of things that were supports for them to get going comfortably. That was really the key thing, is get that rapport building, the trust building piece happening early, and give them some supports, but still the conversation was confidential, it was fluid, and it went where it needed to go, as Doug said.
Great. Yeah. Well, that's that. It doesn't sound mechanical. So, and thank you for sharing that. But